I'm delighted and I want to join my Executive Director, Allison, to thank Kiril Sokoloff, my old friend and founder and chairman of 13D, for making this event possible. Kiril and I probably go back 25, 27 years. I've known him as an excellent investment advisor. He knows geopolitics and geoeconomics very well. And the best thing I like about him is he doesn't, perhaps some say not like me, bullshit. If he has a view, he has a view. If he doesn't have a view, he doesn't have a view. And if he doesn't talk about something, it's probably because he doesn't have a view or he's thinking about it. And I remember about 8, 9 months before Donald Trump became the president, Kiril began to tell me, he said, Ronnie, I don't think we should write off that guy. I think that guy have a good chance to become the president of the United States. And sure enough, Kiril, you're right again. But I'm getting used to the fact that you're right many, many times. And we're delighted that you're with us here today and to share your thoughts. Of course, we're here because Professor Graham Allison is going to speak about his book. We all know, Graham, that he needs no introduction. This is the 4th time in the last 2 years that I have found myself in an occasion such as this one to work with Graham on his book and on his thesis. 2 of those 3 times previously were related to the Asia Society. So for those of you who have not joined the Asia Society, in spite of what Alice Monk have said, please do so. If you're smart, you will. First time, Graham, we were in Singapore. Asia Society invited Graham to speak. It was a really, really wonderful event where a lot of the dignitaries hosted us. I suspect that it's partly because of Graham. And then another time we were at the palace of the King of Belgium, and we had a wonderful time there as well. And that, too, was a program of the Asia Society because the King of Belgium wants to work with us at the Asia Society on trilateral relationship between Europe, U.S., and Asia, in particular China. By the way, if you are really involved in the Asia Society, you may be invited to one of those things one of these days, and I'll be there next week. The third time was Eric Lee. Some of you may have known Eric. Eric will be coming here later today. He is a trustee of the Asia Society Hong Kong Center, and he invited Graham to give a talk in Beijing, in which I participated. It is wonderful to have him present in different occasions, big crowd, small crowd, and it's always very, very enlightening. So the program today is very simple. I will first invite Graham to come up to make some opening presentations, perhaps 10, 15 minutes. He will have some slides. And then I will invite Kiril to come up to disagree with Graham. Whatever Graham says that is wrong, I expect, Kiril, you will point it out and defend yourself. And after that, we'll engage in some dialogue and then open to the floor. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Professor Graham Allison.
So thank you very much, Ronnie. Thank you, Kiril. Thank those of you for coming tonight, especially some of you whom I know and some whom I'm looking forward to getting a chance to interact with. I told Kiril and Ronnie that I was coming to Hong Kong because I'm searching for new, big, radical, unconventional ideas about how to escape Thucydides' trap. So my book is not about fatalism, a war between the U.S. and China that would be catastrophic. It's not about even pessimism. It's about even some urgency in the need for imagination. And I think there's rarely a place, or very few places like Hong Kong, where folks are some combination of Chinese and Americans and Hong Kongese and internationals, but are not possible to think of things that are a little different as Hong Kong is from the rest of the world. So I would say I'm hoping tonight and in the conversations that follow, or even some emails, that I'll hear some ideas. We started that earlier today, and Kiril and I have thought of 5 so far, but I need 15 before I go home. So I'm going to take fewer than 15 minutes to first start with, I'll give you 4 bottom lines. So on the trade tiff that's spilling off over into the technology space now with Qualcomm and ZDT, expect things to get worse before they get worse. And if you want a further account of that, I had a piece this weekend in the National Interest, which you can Google and find. Second point, the reason why things are going to get worse was explained to us by Thucydides about 2,500 years ago. And it is that when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, one finds a dangerous dynamic in which things like a tariff conflict or even a trade war or even an economic war are not uncommon and are extremely dangerous. Point 3, I was in Beijing just 3 or 4 weeks ago for the China Development Forum. I had a chance both there and in one-on-ones to talk directly to and listen to all the leadership of China below Xi Jinping. And when I got back, H.R. McMaster, who was then the National Security Advisor, who's a friend for a long time and whom I've consulted during this administration, said, Graham, what's your takeaway? I said, well, if Thucydides were watching, he would say, all the actors are right on script, moving, seeming inexorably, towards what will be the grandest collision in history. And finally, to fourth bottom line to show I'm not entirely pessimistic, on one front, North Korea, I think it is likely that the summit between Moon and Kim Jong-un next week will be successful and declared a success. I think the summit that'll follow between Trump and Kim Jong-un, which again you could sell at a high price, opportunities to be a fly on the wall, so it'll be interesting. But I think that's going to be a success. In fact, I outline in a piece that you can read in last week's Politico why I think there's going to be a 6-win solution. And if we come in the questions and answers, we may want to discuss that further. So that's so much for bottom lines. What I'm going to do in the remaining period is 3 things. First, I'm going to introduce you, or reintroduce most of you, I hope, you to a great thinker. Secondly, I'm going to present to you a big idea. And third, I'm going to pose a most consequential question. So the great thinker is Thucydides. Let's see if we can make this work. Thucydides. I know that many people have difficulty with his name. So in unison, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Thucydides. One more time. Thucydides. So if nothing else, when you go home tonight, you can tweet or tell your friend or colleague, I met tonight a great thinker, and I can even pronounce his name. Okay? Thucydides was the father and founder of history. He wrote the first ever history book. Its title is The History of the Peloponnesian War. You can go to your web and download the book for free. Just download book 1. Read the first 100 pages, book 1. And if every other page doesn't knock your socks off, check your pulse. So this is a serious thinker. And actually, it's very interesting how fascinated Xi Jinping and Wang Qishan and others in the leadership of China are by this fellow Thucydides and by Thucydides' trap. So the idea that there was somebody who lived 2,500 years ago, roughly a contemporary of Confucius, who identified a pattern in history that we've seen replayed many times with catastrophic consequences, pretty fascinating, especially if you have some respect for history. So 1, 2, 3, Thucydides. Okay. So the big idea is called Thucydides' trap. This is a concept I coined a half dozen years ago to make vivid an insight that Thucydides had. So Thucydides was writing about the Great War in classical Greece between Athens, the rising city-state, and Sparta, the city-state that had ruled for 100 years. And Thucydides said famously, or wrote famously, it was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made the war inevitable. So when a rising power like Athens, or like Germany 100 and a bit years ago, prior to World War I, or China in the last generation, rises to threaten to displace a ruling power like Sparta, which had ruled Greece for 100 years, or Britain, which had ruled the world for 100 years, or America, just at the end of an American century, in general, bad things happen. In the book, I look at the last 500 years of history. I find 16 cases in which a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, 12 of the cases in war, 4 of the cases in not war. So to say that war between the U.S. and China is inevitable, that's even wrong on the record. And Thucydides doesn't mean inevitable 100%. He just means likely, very likely. But to say that war between the U.S. and China is more likely than not in the course of history would not be incorrect. And the consequential question is basically the subtitle of the book. Can America and China escape Thucydides' trap? As I said at the beginning, that's the thing in which I'm scratching my head, searching for ideas, trying to understand better, as are many people in China today, as are many people in the U.S. today, but there's no monopoly of wisdom in Washington. There's no monopoly of wisdom in Beijing or in Harvard. So there's no reason why people in Hong Kong can't contribute to this conversation significantly. And if I'm successful tonight, I'm hoping that I'm going to stir you up a little bit to try to make some contribution.
Now, first, I want to make a comment about this trap. I find it difficult because I even don't know how to pronounce its name.
You know, the Thucydian trap that people talk about.
The so-called Thucydides trap.
The Thucydides trap.
Thucydides trap.
The Thucydides trap.
Thucydides trap.
The Thucydides trap.
So the concept of Thucydides trap has jumped immediately into the bloodstream of the policy debate because, as Henry Kissinger has argued, this is the best lens available for looking through the noise and news of the day to understand, to reach to the underlying dynamic. So what we have today is a rising China that is impacting a ruling U.S., and that dangerous dynamic creates huge risks. So here's the last summit between Xi Jinping and President Obama. And as you can see from the slide, both are talking about how countries like the U.S. and China can escape Thucydides' trap. And in particular, Xi Jinping has come to this formulation of a call for a so-called new form of great power relations. When I was in Beijing in December talking to another person who works directly for Xi Jinping, he said to me, why do you think we call this new form of great power relations? Because we recognize what's the old form and the consequence of the old form. So we've got to invent something new. And here's Xi Jinping at Davos in 2017, again, trying to struggle with the question how to escape Thucydides' trap. So I don't need to spend much time on the first point here, the rise of China. Those of you who lived here see this all the time. But this is a bridge that goes across the Charles River in Cambridge between the business school and the Kennedy School. I can see it out my office. The renovation of it, the discussion began when I was dean of the Kennedy School. I quit being dean in 1989. Project began in earnest in 2012. It was a 2-year project. In 2014, they said not done. Take another year. 2015, they said not done. It'll take another year. It's 3 times over budget. 2016, they said we're not telling you when it's going to be done. Okay, and now at least the traffic is flowing. There's a bridge in Beijing. It's called the Shenyang Bridge. Some of you know it. It's got about twice as many lanes of traffic. In 2015, the mayor there decided they should renovate it. How long did it take to complete the project? Make a guess? How much? 6 months. You can go to YouTube. 43 hours. 43 hours before the traffic is flowing. And it works fine. Actually, the deputy mayor there is a graduate of a Kennedy School program. And I said to him in December, if he would bring the guys that fix this to Cambridge and fix it, I would make a small contribution. So that's just from YouTube. In my course at Harvard, I give students a quiz, 53 indicators. This is just a short version. There's a little bit about it in the book. When could China become number one? The largest manufacturing, largest trading, most billionaires, fastest supercomputers, largest economy in the world. And they have to fill in the quiz here, their year, 2030, 2040, not in my lifetime. Then I show them a second slide that says already. All these things already happened. In case you missed it, the IMF released their report on the international economy week before last. Who has the largest economy in the world today? China, not the U.S. Despite the reporting in the newspapers about China as the second largest economy. No. Take the yardstick chosen both by the IMF and the CIA for comparing national economies. According to that yardstick, China today is about 21.2 trillion, end of 17, and the U.S. about 19. So the question is the impact of the rise of China on the U.S., the American sense of our role in the world, and the international order that the U.S. has been the principal guardian of for the past 7 decades. 7 decades, not accidentally, that were decades without great power war. So this is a slide I produced for the Senate Armed Services Committee in 2014. The ranking member is a former student of mine, Jack Reed, and he said, we need a context for the debate about President Obama's initiative to Asia. You remember the name of the Obama initiative? What was it called? The Pivot, okay? So, and what was the pivot about? The pivot was about putting less weight on our left foot in the Middle East, fighting wars, in order to put more weight on our right foot in Asia, where the future is. So this is a cartoon to try to illustrate what's actually been happening. Imagine seesaws in a schoolyard with kids on either end who are each the size of their GDP. So in 2004, China is about 20% the size of the U.S. In 2014, China became slightly larger. In 2024, on the current trend lines, it'll be half again bigger. So while Americans have been debating whether we should have more weight on our left foot or our right foot, China's just been growing to the point that both feet have lifted off the ground. You see this in the trading in the whole region. China is now the principal trading partner of all the Asian countries and 130 others.
The committee meets today to consider the nomination of General James Mattis to be the Secretary of Defense of the United States. I thank both Senator Nunn and Senator Cohen for being here.
He's probably the only one here at this table who can hear the words Thucydides trap and not have to go to Wikipedia.
Of course, Secretary Cohen has insulted every member of this committee by suggesting that we don't readily understand that.
We're going to have to manage that competition between us and China. There's another piece of wisdom from antiquity that says fear, honor, and interest always seem to be the root causes of why a nation chooses to go to hostilities.
Okay, so Thucydides is full of big ideas. Where did Mattis get the idea about interests, fear, and honor? Thucydides. Beginning of each one of the chapters actually has a little epigraph from Thucydides. So lots of big ideas in the book. One particular one that I'm interested in for us exploring tonight is Thucydides' trap, but that's not the end of the story. So finally, Korea. At Mar-a-Lago, and then again when he was in Beijing, President Trump has kept saying to Xi Jinping, the problem for me now, my most important problem, my most urgent problem is North Korea. And either you're going to help me solve the problem or I'm going to solve it on my own, and if I solve it on my own, you're not going to like it. At this point, it looked most likely that nothing good was going to happen and that Trump would have attacked North Korea to prevent it completing a set of ICBM tests that would have given it a reliable capability to strike the U.S. with nuclear weapons. That certainly was Trump's intention, and that's what he had said. Fortunately now, things are moving in a better direction, so that I see the prospect of a framework agreement coming out of first set up by the Moon meeting and then by the Trump meeting, and then a set of negotiations that'll go on for some considerable period of time. And that'll be criticized, and they should be criticized, but I think when I look at it, it will be the worst possible solution except for every other feasible alternative. So that's my optimistic note. To the final question that I started with, can America and China escape Thucydides' trap? The book has a professorial no and yes. So no, if we settle for business as usual, for diplomacy as usual, for statescraft as usual, then we should expect history as usual. And history as usual in this case would be a catastrophic war. But on the other hand, yes, as Santayanta taught us, only those who refuse to study history are condemned to repeat it. So we're not obliged to make mistakes that were made by our predecessors. So I'm hoping we're going to have some imagination about how to escape Thucydides' trap. I would have written that book by now if I knew the answer. I don't. So I'm looking for ideas and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Graham. It was excellent, as always. Kiril, I'll start with you. Kiril's ear is not the best, so I may have to repeat the question sometimes. Kiril, you agree with Graham? Are you as optimistic or pessimistic as Graham? Where do you think it will all end?
Actually, I do agree with Graham. I think that the major issue is not going to be trade as much as it is technology and military technology. If we think about conventional nuclear weapons, that's a 20th century weapon. It's no longer where the future is. It's the weaponization of space. It's undersea drones. It's hypersonic vehicles. And in some of these areas, China is leading. And then, of course, we have machine learning, and we have artificial intelligence. I call them, they're different things by my definition. And then we have gene enhancement. In many other areas, China is leading. However, there's a wild card here that I would like to introduce that might change the dynamics. You all are familiar with the Me Too movement, and you've watched powerful men be taken down in 24 hours that you never thought was possible. This is the new world that we live in, that what you thought was the world, the superstructure that was there, all of a sudden is crashing, and it's like a domino. There isn't any man who hasn't been taken down except for Donald Trump. He's the only one left. Now, there are 309 women running for Congress this year so far, and there are 50 running for the Senate. And I have an internal bet with our people that these women are going to win. There have been 6 special elections this year. 4 of them have gone to women. There has been a legislative primary in the state of Texas, and half of the wins were women. Now, it's early days. There are 25,000 women who are working with an organization called Emily.com, which essentially is helping a woman who's motivated to change what she sees as the country she doesn't like and the culture she's not happy with to run for public office. These are young women, these are millennial women, these are intelligent, and they want to make change. So let's fast forward to the election. 20% of the Congress is female. Let's say you have, I'm picking a number, another 100 women join the Congress. If the House swings 23 seats, if I recall, towards the Democrats, then impeachment proceedings will begin against Donald Trump. I'm just calling the reality. I'm not taking a stand here at all. As you know, I'm just here to tell you what I think could happen. I'm also told from a very good source that there are 20 Republican senators who would vote in favor of impeachment at the present time. So this is a situation that no one yet has focused on, and this could change everything. So what would the Congress be like, leaving Donald Trump out of it? What would the Congress be like with a huge influx of women that could be the biggest political movement in a generation? Would be much different. Do women want to send their sons to war? I don't think so. Do they want to engage in foreign adventurism? I don't think so. They want to fix the educational system in America, which is the worst of the major developed countries. They want to stop school shooting and make them safe. They want to end the opioid crisis. They want to fix what's wrong with America. And a lot of men, I'm told, are coming up to these women and saying, I like what you have to say, I'm going to vote for you. And the women may tell their husbands, maybe you should stay home this voting day. Otherwise, no dinner for a couple of months, right? So this is we're now 6-7 months away from the election. As Ronnie mentioned, I did call the Donald Trump election correctly because I saw the people who'd been left behind, and I knew they were going to vote against the existing power structure and the elites that had abandoned them. The women's movement is more powerful. There is huge anger. We can't underestimate how it's going to change America and eventually the world. All I'm saying is this could just change this dynamic, and we have to be open to it, and this could put off this confrontation, which, based on history, is inevitable. and more importantly, based on the differences in culture and belief between America and China. So America believes there's one truth. It's democracy, it's human rights, it's free enterprise. In China, they are proud of their unique cultural differences. They don't want to be part of the American exceptionalism spreading its model. That is a huge difference from the past and makes this much more risky. And then you add to that military superiority as a possibility with the advanced technology, and you have China that has three advantages. It has a late mover advantage, meaning that they can leapfrog over the existing legacy systems to move right into the latest technology without any problems of legacy hindrances. The second is China is developing technology that doesn't have a commercial application, which doesn't happen in the United States at the moment. When DARPA was up and strong, it did exist. And the third, you have industry and the government are working together very closely on a target for dominance in certain areas. So anyway, that's my thought of it.
Well, okay, let's take your last point. Graham, why is America so fearful? You used the word fear just now. The existing power fear something. What is the nature of what's the essence of that fear? What is the main fear? Is it trade? Is it weaponry, as Kiril mentioned? Is it ideological difference? What is it?
No, in a word, it's psychological. So the word...
It's on.
It's okay? Yeah. The word fear was used by Thucydides. So this is his idea. And in the story of a rising power and a ruling power, this dynamic is one in which the rising power thinks, I'm bigger, I'm stronger, I deserve more say, I deserve more sway, we should do some things more my way. And the current arrangements that were put in place didn't even take me into account. They were put there before I ever got there. That's all seems quite reasonable. And I describe that in the book as the rising power syndrome. And you see this in every case. And the ruling power, whether Sparta or Britain or the U.S., says, wait a minute. Just like an incumbent and an upstart in the business world. What the hell do you think you're doing? I'm the taxi industry and you're Uber. Or I'm virtually any industry and you're Google or Apple. Okay? I think, wait a minute. I've been doing this all my life. Actually, because I was doing this, you've had the opportunity to get your start and to grow and to get bigger and to get stronger. You should be grateful. You should be appreciative. You shouldn't be trying to change things the way they are and were and should be. This is natural. So the fear that's instilled in the ruling power is completely normal if you think of it in psychological terms. And then it can get to be exaggerated because, again, the Greek language has these wonderful progressions. After fear comes paranoia. And if you want to see in the Washington context today, most, I think, people here, at least as I've noticed talking earlier today, have missed. There's been a sea change in Washington in the past year in the belief of who is China and what is China and how should the U.S. relate to China. So if you last watched during the Obama administration, that movie is over for the center of gravity. Before, if you said, who is China, they're our partner or our strategic partner. And that's for Obama, that's for Bush, that's for Clinton. Today, China is our rival, our strategic rival, or our strategic adversary. So what to do with China? in Obama, Bush, Clinton, integrate them into the international order, and they'll become more responsible stakeholders. They'll help support this structure, and then they'll become to have human rights like we understand them, and they'll have democracies like we have them, that we understand them, and then that's the story. Read the national security strategy from the Trump administration. It says that was a bet, big bet that was made for a long time. That bet turned out to be false. And this view of the Trump administration is reflected not just simply in the Trump administration literature. Look at the article by Kurt Campbell, who was the architect of the pivot for Obama. The Foreign Affairs piece this month says these fundamental assumptions turned out to be wrong. So there's a big reassessment going on in Washington today about China and how to relate to China, and it's informed by this fear, some of which is rational, that is, it really is true. China is bigger and stronger and wanting to change things, and part of which is exaggerated in just the way ruling powers often get things wrong.
My problem with the word psychology, Graham, is that it is to a good extent emotional. It is not necessarily rational.
Right.
But there must be a rational aspect to that fear as well. So back to my original question. Was it the military rise of China that scares America, or at least worries Americans? Is it trade? Is it ideological? What is it? Apart from just emotive factors, the real factors, hardcore things that we as business people have to deal with.
Well,
and then I'm going to turn to you for that one, Kiril. You answer that afterwards. Please.
So first, let me disagree slightly with I'll answer the question, but let me disagree with it. The reason why Mattis's quote of Thucydides is correct, and why it's powerful, and why it's frustrating to people who are simply realistic businessmen, is that in history, there are three big variables that have led states to war repeatedly. One is their interests. That's very objective. A second is their honor. This gets more complicated. Honor, or respect, is having the deference that I'm due. Excuse me, I am at the top of every pecking order. You are small.
You're right.
And you've grown up in this environment. You should be respectful. That's what it is, to have relations between the smaller and the larger, the bigger and the stronger. And then, Thucydides says, there's fear, which is psychological, some of which can be reasonable fear. That is, if you find a tiger in the jungle, you should be fearful. That's a good idea. But in this dangerous dynamic that Thucydides reminds us of, you exaggerate everything. So I look and I say, wait a minute. Not only are they bigger and stronger, the reason why they want to be bigger and stronger is because they probably want to displace me. Now, if you talk to Xi Jinping or anybody in the Chinese government today, they would say, this has nothing to do with you. Our 19th party plan, ambitious and audacious as this is, that's about us. We're trying to have China be China, the way we would like to restore ourselves to the place that we ever were before. But from an American perspective, as one sees that, it's not just that China wants the American ships not to be doing what they're doing in the South China Sea. It's that, wait, China would like to be a leader in artificial intelligence. Would they? Of course they would. If you thought that was the next industry up and that was going to have big military implications, would you be a little fearful about that? Because if they were the dominant power within the military domain, would they exercise that? Well, the Chinese would say, no, we've always been a peaceful power. We never have dealt with anybody outside. To which the answer is, look at their history. Ask the Koreans, ask the Vietnamese, okay? They spent thousands of years, or hundreds of years in the second case, dominating these countries. I don't think China has aspirations to be occupying anybody else's territory, but it does aspire, understandably, to be restored to what it thinks is its natural place that it exercised for all of history in their story until a couple of hundred years ago when these Westerners showed up with their technologies to exploit them and humiliate them. And I think we're becoming big and strong again, and we would like to get back to the way things ought to be. And so I think it would be nice to be able to say to them, oh, this is just a misunderstanding. I don't think this is just a misunderstanding. I think there's a real conflict of interest in many areas. There's a real conflict with respect to honor or respect and deference. And there's a difference in the psychological or emotional domain. Yeah.
Well, Kiril, what do you say? I'm getting nowhere with the professor, so maybe you as an investment advisor.
Well, I have money manager clients, and some of them are American. And I've been bullish on China since I first came here to invest in 1992. And there have been times you want to invest and times you don't want to invest, but generally I've been bullish. So if I try to speak to an American from, let's say, 2007 until maybe a year ago about China, no one wanted to hear it. You couldn't have a conversation with them. They were emotional, and so I stopped talking about it. So I thought about it for a long time. Why did they have this fear? And it's because there are 1.3 billion people who are working incredibly hard, and it's like they have this subliminal desire for China to crash. That's why there's all this conversation there was for the last 10 years, overbuilding, Ponzi scheme, too much debt, it can't go on. It's because of this subliminal desire that China should crash so it won't be a problem. So that's part of it. About 2 years ago, I started to tell my clients there was going to be a re-rating. So China was down here, Europe was here, and America was up here. I said there's going to be a re-rating. And China will be seen to be not a Ponzi scheme, but the great growth market that it really is. The euro will hold together, and the EU will be seen as a place to invest. And America will be seen as flawed. And that is exactly what's happened. And the turning point was, and I'll tell you in a second, if you drive across the United States, you get to the Continental Divide, but you never know when you pass it. And the Continental Divide are rivers flowing east and rivers flowing west. It's not like there's a line saying you've passed the Continental Divide. So the moment of the turning point when China became a real threat was, to me, Davos and Xi.
2017.
17.
Yeah.
February.
So here we have Trump has just taken over. He's saying, I'm withdrawing from TPP. I'm going to leave the Paris Accord. I don't want to buy from you. I'm going to beat up Mexico and Canada on NAFTA, and I'm going to take China on. Xi is saying, I believe in the environment. I want to buy from you, and I believe in free trade. And it was a magnificent moment of great strategy. And that, I believe, was the crossing of the Continental Divide. So China went from being a Ponzi scheme in people's minds to, oh my God, they're real. We got to worry about them. Now, every day, you're reading about China being more advanced in this technology and that technology. We write about it all the time. Whether it's actually true or whether it's almost true, there's a lot of truth to it. And the reason is because innovation is deemed to be only American. But if you look at the innovators, half of them are immigrants, and Trump wants to keep them out. We have a big Indian office, and they say the H-1B visa applications in the United States are down by 50%. Pre-Trump, they want to stay home. And China could become a hotbed of attracting global talent. Robert Kwok, the founder of Shangri-La and the Sugar King, wrote his autobiography. He's 95 years old. And he said that the greatest entrepreneurs in the world come from South China. That's absolutely true. If you look at Southeast Asia, who dominated the trade the last 300 or 400 years? It's the South Chinese entrepreneurs. You look at this room, you're all from South China, right? I mean, China is an entrepreneurial hotbed. Added to that is my theme that countries come alive at various points. Think about Renaissance Florence, a town of maybe 2,000 people. 100 artistic geniuses. Don't tell me that somebody taught them how to be a genius. They were set on fire by something. And then we saw the same thing in Germany. We've seen the same thing in France. We've seen the same thing in the UK, the same thing in the United States. It's my belief that China is on fire in entrepreneurial ability, innovation, passion, and President Xi at the Party Congress said that very thing.
Let me go back to Trump. Graham, you mentioned that Clinton, Bush too, Obama, they were all more or less considering China as a not partner, but at least not an adversary.
Oh, partner.
How much partner? Okay. How much of it is Trump that really pushed the thing in, shall I say, the wrong direction, and then everybody just buy in, and you have some hardcore people like Kurt Campbell, my friend, in the Obama administration, then re-examine himself and say, I was wrong, our premises were wrong, perhaps Trump was right. No, not perhaps, Trump was right. It's pretty, honest, bold of him to say that I was wrong. So how much of it is because of Trump? If it has not been for Trump, would it have been a little better? The process might have been prolonged a little before it get to where we are today?
I would say that fundamentally it's not about Trump. Fundamentally it's about this awakening to China that has become bigger and stronger that Americans are just slowly waking up to. And I think you can see this now across the whole policy spectrum, of which Kurt's piece is a good example, but you can see this right across the political spectrum. So when I was in Beijing, again, I mentioned 3 weeks ago, one of my friends there said to me, he said, Graham, what's happened in Washington? People seem to have lost their mind. So I said, well, that's a frequent comment in Cambridge as far as, but what do you mean in particular? He says, with respect to China, what the hell is going on? You see, the whole place seems to have done a backflip. And I said, well, I think that's right. Where do you see this? He said, who gave the loudest shout out for Trump's tariffs against China? I said, I don't know who. The Democratic leader of the Senate, Chuck Schumer. So basically, this is just, now what's going on? It's hard to tell. First, most Americans have ADD, so their attention span is not great.
Attention deficiency. Right.
So lots of the foreign policy community's head has been stuck in the sand in the Middle East, fighting wars for the whole 21st century. So that's a big deal for most of these people's lives. So now they're up looking around a little bit and thinking, whoa, here's a giant panda in the room, and nobody even told me. Nobody consulted me. Nobody invited them into, how can they have got this big and this strong? So it's a little bit like, hello, and as I say, my Chinese friend was saying, we haven't been hiding, we've been just going in our own fashion. So this is not like we were creeping up on you or this was meant to be some form of surprise. So a little bit of awakening to that. Awakening in the context of the Thucydidean dynamic. I want to keep going back to this. Unless one sees how deeply rooted this is in structural conditions that have played themselves out 2,500 years ago and 500 years ago in Spain versus Portugal and 200 years ago and 100 years. We've seen this story before. The storyline is very clear, and the elements of it, which seem strange, because if you were to go back 100 years ago, just before World War I, it was not hard to figure out that war between Britain and Germany would be catastrophic. Indeed, the best-selling book in Europe in the whole decade before 1914 was a famous book by Norman Angell. It's called The Grand Illusion. And it said, war cannot happen anymore because the victor will lose more, even though he wins, than he expended in the course of the war. So many people go, okay, if war is, if you know that it's a losing proposition, who would fight a war? Which answers only Britain and Germany and all the other powers of Europe in the context. So I think that basically you've got this dawning awakening, and I think Trump has offered his own color to the matter and his own sort of extreme formulation from time to time. But overall, it's deeply rooted, and it's very, I would say, extremely dangerous, because for Washington, which has trouble focusing its mind anyhow, the notion of an enemy is at least a category that people can recognize. And externalizing one's problems by blaming somebody else is, again, a deep historical pattern. Yeah.
Well, Graham, you scared the heck out of me. Because I thought that with nuclear arsenal on both sides, given mutual assured destruction, that perhaps nuclear would become a deterrent. But what you're telling me is perhaps nuclear deterrent is not there.
Well, no, I would say you're absolutely right, that the fact that nuclear weapons at the level of arsenals that China and the U.S. have mean that if ever, God forbid, there should be a nuclear war, we might succeed in killing everybody. So that seems like a clearly bad idea. That has a crystal ball effect, as security students say, that helps you look and say, okay, wait a minute, that's like committing suicide. So nobody would wisely or thoughtfully choose nuclear war. The question is whether you could have a choice about whether Kim Jong-un should be able to test ICBMs in such a way that he could attack the U.S. with nuclear weapons. And you could imagine a person like Trump saying, no, this is a little pipsqueak country. Why should they be able to threaten American cities? And if I have to attack them in order to prevent this, I'll do it. And then he attacks them, let's imagine. And now you have a second Korean War. So everybody should go back to their history books and remember what happened in the first Korean War. In 1950, the furthest thing from Mao's mind was to go fight Superman. America had just dropped atomic bombs in Japan 5 years before. Mao had just barely consolidated control over the mainland. He did not want a war with the U.S. The U.S. didn't want to fight China. It had had a chance to get involved in the Civil War if it wanted to, and decide, no, do not fight on the Asian mainland. Those turn out badly, okay? That was wise advice. Lo and behold, though, North Korea attacks South Korea, almost captures the whole place. U.S. comes to the rescue the last minute, pushes back without thinking right across the 38th parallel towards the Chinese border. Chinese come into the war and beat the Americans right back down to the 38th parallel. So that's a war that nobody chose, quote, nobody wanted a war between U.S. and China, but such a war happened. And I think that while nuclear weapons are another, fortunately, cautionary element, anybody who thinks that they mean, therefore, there could not possibly be a nuclear war should go back and study the Cuban Missile Crisis, about which I wrote a book earlier. In 1962, the most dangerous moment in recorded history, John Kennedy, a otherwise quite wise man, was prepared to run what he thought was a 1 in 3 chance of nuclear war that would have killed 100 million people then, to prevent the Soviet Union sneaking nuclear-tipped missiles into Cuba. So you go back and look at that and you say, wait a minute, do that again for me on an expected value basis. Here's the guy putting nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba. He already has nuclear-tipped missiles in the Soviet Union that can attack you. And you're going to take a 1 in 3 chance of killing 100 million people? The answer is yes, okay? So that's only to say it's a helpful factor, but not decisive.
Kiril, I like business people, I like investors, they are more rational. What's your take on that same question?
Well, let's look at machine learning, which is probably the most interesting technology in the world, at least to me. So it's a machine that teaches itself. So obviously, Deep Blue was going to beat the best chess master. No surprise. Chess is a memory game. But about 1.5 years ago, Google's DeepMind developed a machine called AlphaGo Zero. And it beat the best Go player 4 games to 1, which is a huge shock to Asians particularly because they understand how Go is a game of intuition. But those of us who study this, we said, oh boy, this has changed everything. So last fall, DeepMind launched AlphaGo. You know, these names are all the same, but essentially it's a different machine. And all they did was to give the machine the rudiments of how to play chess. They didn't teach it, they didn't program it, and it learned in 30 hours 1,400 years of chess history and beat all of the best chess playing machines 50-0. And those who studied the game said, this is the best chess game ever played in the history of chess. Because it was different. It was only about winning. So there was huge losses at the beginning of major pieces that shocked the chess experts. Now let's go forward. Let's think about what this means. This means that whoever controls these machines will look at the problems of the world strategically, militarily, with a different slant than has ever been looked at before. So the worst thing that could happen in the United States is an EMP attack. An EMP attack is if you set off a nuclear weapon above the United States, every single piece of electronics would be destroyed permanently. The grid would be down. There would be riots. It's generally acknowledged that there's nothing worse outside of a bubonic plague that could happen. And the
or a real nuclear war. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So, you know, imagine that you were Russia or you were Iran, and you have such a machine that is more advanced than AlphaGo. And AlphaGo is not the most advanced. It's just the only one that went public because those who created it wanted recognition. So we have no idea where various countries are, and the rate of acceleration is so astronomical. What happened 3 months ago, we just have no idea where it is now. So let's say you're Russia. How could we create the impact of an EMP attack without setting off a nuclear weapon? I'm told that this technology exists. So the whole nature of warfare has changed. And I don't think any of us have any idea where it can go. And the question is, as always, will the dark forces control it? And I had a long conversation with Henry Kissinger about this. He said, well, maybe the machine is the dark force. Maybe it is. And this was Stephen Hawking's point, that these machines we are launching on the world, we have no idea how to control them. Now, if the machine is smarter than we are, what's the first thing the machine would do? It would turn off the ability of the human to control it. So what I'm saying is the nature of warfare has changed because of technology. It's a whole different world out there. And with machine learning, think about this. In 30 hours, AlphaGo mastered chess better than any chess player in history because it kept learning. The human, if we're lucky, we learn from our mistakes, or we watch other people make mistakes and we learn from them. But the machine is learning at the speed of light over and over and over again. Try, fail, better, 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 better. And now I was asking our analyst who studies this, would quantum computing, which means China's supposedly going to have a quantum computer in 2019 that will be 1 million times faster than all of the computing power in the world today. So I said, will that make machine learning more effective? The answer is no, it seems like it was going slower was better, but who knows where it's going? So it's just such a complicated technical subject, and we don't have any idea. But if you want to be scared, that's the place to be scared.
Graham, perhaps your problem is not that big of a problem in face of what Kiril had just said. That before the U.S.-China goes to war, if it goes to war, perhaps you have this problem.
Maybe the machines get both of us, yes.
Right. Or perhaps this will force the U.S. and China to work together in order to prevent something of that nature from happening. Well, the last question goes to Kiril. It is the most important question. Given this troubled world that we're in today, where should I put my money in the next 1 year and in the next 10 years, Kiril? Where are you putting your money?
Oh, that's a good question. The next year in oil.
Oil? Got it?
Yeah.
Oil.
Yeah.
Okay. 10 years?
10 years.
If we live that long.
God willing.
Yeah, God willing, exactly. I would having in emerging markets.
Emerging markets.
Emerging markets.
Where is that?
Just
Africa,
a broad investment in emerging markets.
Would China still be an emerging market too?
Well, I would include that. I mean, it's not really an emerging market, but yeah.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, living in Hong Kong, you are in. We are in the midst of we are a first world city in the midst of developing economies, and so we're delighted that we are at least in the right place. We are far enough from North Korea also. Anyway, I have a book here for the two of them. It is very befitting. We have a show being shown, Robert, Indiana, at our Chantal Miller gallery. It's called Love Long. So while we are worrying about everything, let's love long. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause to our two speakers, Graham Allison and Kiril Sokoloff.